friends. Today's topic of discussion is patriotic films during British times. So in the course of our discussion we'll try to talk about some of the films which were made during the colonial or the British period and how these films were talking in the framework of the patriotic ideas as India was under the British rule, and because of the kind of excesses which were committed by the British in different spheres, Indians were not at all satisfied. So we find that how the national movement gained momentum so that India can break itself from the shackles of the colonial or the British rule. In that case, some of the filmmakers, they made their films keeping in mind the contemporary situation, and their films, whether they belong to the genre of the mythologicals, devotionals, stunt films, social reform theme films, all of them in some or the other way they reflected the ideas of patriotism. And it was also evident through these films that the filmmakers, they were also quite aware about the kind of things which were happening in the Indian society, and they in fact wanted that how India can become independent. But at the same time, we also have to realize that British, through their censorship policy, did not want that any kind of an idea which was patriotic in nature, which could in a way motivate the Indians in any manner through the medium of films or through any kind of propaganda. British, they did not like that such kind of ideas they should be propagated in the Indian society. So we find that they come with various kinds of measures in the Indian context where they imposed the censorship norms in different manner. And because of this kind of a censorship, we also find that many times many of the patriotic and ideas or the ideas which are concerned with the national movement, they were being rejected by the colonial censors, and we find that many films, they were in a way were being censored, or their dialogues, etc., or their scenes, they were being deleted. If one can refer some of the readings or the kind of bibliography of the books which one can see is the Aruna Vasudev's Liberty and License in Indian Cinema, Firoz Rangoonwala's 75 Years of Indian Cinema and the Indian Freedom Struggle by Gautam Kaul. So one can refer to these kinds of readings when one is talking about, apart from some of the files which are there in the National Archives of India which deal with the censorship machinery. And when one is talking about cinema, when in the framework of patriotic ideas, one sees that Indian cinema, it grew during the freedom struggle, and it was very natural that the ideals and the objectives of the freedom struggle, they were also being evident in many of the films. Then we also see that how, while interacting with the socio-political realities, the Hindi cinema was also influencing as well as being influenced by such kind of things. And as students of history or as students of literature, they try to interpret cinema or films, we find that they approach them from different perspectives. From the historical point of view, we find that the people, those who are associated with history, they try to see cinema as any kind of a new audiovisual source of writing history. And when you talk about the nationalist aspirations and the motives, that how they were being depicted in the films of that particular period, we find that many of them, they contained these kinds of ideas, and they also served an important purpose of inspiring others by when they got to see such kind of motives and ideas in the films. We also see that how the national leaders, many of them, they used cinema and during the elections as well. So it was seen to be a sort of an instrument of propaganda during that time. And one can also see that how it is also linked to culture, and culture is being promoted. The question of fashion and identity is also very integral to films. And when one talks about the question of identity, identity can be understood in different frameworks, and a person can have multiple kind of identities depending upon the place he is in. So these kinds of things, they were also very relevant at that point of time, and we find that if one talks about the silent era, 1913 to 31 was the period when we did not have sound in the films, in the sense that there were no dialogues. And we find that Dada Saheb Phalke, who is considered to be the father of Indian cinema. He definitely played an important role in that sense, and initial films, many of them, we find that these films were mythological in nature. And when you talk about the silent era, it does not mean that the films they were completely silent, because some of the musicians, they sat on the floor and they tried to narrate the story of the film, or they in a way engaged themselves in music and songs. So we find that if you talk about the initial cinema, many of them, the mythological themes and how people or the audience, they were familiar with them, and the kinds of characters and the events which were taken from the past, from the epics and the scriptures, they were being shown. So this kind of an interaction between the deities, demons and the supernatural powers, that was also being seen. But we also realize that even many of the characters in Iliad and Odyssey by Homer in the Greek history, and there also we find that gods and the human beings, they are interacting. So in that context we find that that is referred to as history, that is not referred to as some kind of a mythology. But in the Indian context, when we talk about such kind of films, we find that they are referred to as mythology, and the kind of character in the context of the history which is associated with these kinds of films, that is being taken away. And we also see that when gods and goddesses, they were appearing on the screen and they were performing the miracles, then the illiterate spectators, they prostrated themselves, taking them as these real. And this happened in the case of the television serials as well in the 80s and 90s. When you see Ramayana and Mahabharata, they were being shown to the audience. So we realized that at that point of time, how these TV actors and actresses, they became so popular, and they were being seen to be gods and goddesses in the real life as well. We also see that apart from the genre of the mythologicals, as it has been referred by the people, those who have tried to classify films into different genres, we find that apart from that, we also had certain films which were the devotional films, and how the holy men and women, they were being endowed with the power to perform the miracles, and how their lives and teachings, they were able to influence the masses as well. And these people, they were being held in great reverence by the masses. And in that context we see people like Tulsidas, Surdas, Tukaram, all of them the saints and the popular saints, and with their ideas they wanted to bring about a lot of change in the society. And we also see that film audience, it had some kind of an infatuation with the myth, with the devout worship of the gods and the goddesses, and they had a lot of faith in the divinity for performing the miracles. And in that context we also see that how the imperialist government had the strict censorship norms, because of which we find that many of the ideas of patriotism, many of the ideas of nationalism, they were being rejected by the colonial censors. And we also find that many of the film producers, they did not want to lose their capital, the kind of investment which a film requires. So what happens that if any kind of a theme which was not liked by the colonial censors, then we find that the filmmakers did not want to venture into making films based on such kind of ideas or genres. And when you see that these films, they were becoming popular, then they were also manifesting the growing national consciousness as well. And when you talk about the popular ideas of gods and goddesses, how they were providing an oblique affirmation of the national sentiments against the threatened domination of an alien culture. So how culture was specific in that sense, and how there was some kind of an urgency that the cultural preservation should be there, and how the films which were coming from Europe, especially Britain, and from America, they had a different kind of culture, and such kind of cultural practices which were being shown in these films, they were not in a way accepted by many of the magazines or journals, or even the individuals, those who were writing in them, that such kind of ethics, such kind of morality which was shown in these films was not suitable for the Indian audience. And especially the youth, they will become astray, they will they will become deviant in the society if they will continue to watch such kind of films which were being exhibited in India from Europe and America. And they also talked about the ideals and the values which were needed for the social regeneration, and how Raja Harishchand's life story was seen as some kind of a parallel to the philosophy of Satyagraha, and how one has to endure suffering with faith in the ultimate victory of good over evil. So these kinds of ideas, they were there with the national movement, how Mahatma Gandhi was also talking about truth and non-violence, and how the spirit of selfless sacrifice was needed to fight the British. So such kind of ideas, they were there at that point of time, and in the atmosphere of the growing anti-imperialism, the mythological was seen in that sense, or it was being interpreted as the symbolic representation of the struggle against tyranny. And journalists like K. Abbas, he talks about that how Lord Krishna's struggle against against tyrant Kans could strike a patriotic note of defiance in the hearts of the cinegoers. And when Lord Krishna was talking about the bad judgment, misrule, oppression and tyranny of Kans, it was suggestive of the colonial oppression and misrule as well. So these kinds of parallels, they could be seen in the various kinds of earlier known stories or earlier known mythological narratives which were there. So when one was talking about Lord Krishna, when one was talking about Kans, then such kind of parallels, that the misrule of Kans was in the framework of what the British were doing in India. And apart from that, how these films, they were trying to use allegory as well, in that sense that Sarandri was a film which was made in 1919. It exposed the regime of Lord Curzon, and Dharmatma in 1935 was talking about untouchability problem, and Gopal Krishna also dealt with the rule of a despot in 1938. So we find that such kind of films, they were trying to talk about the contemporary situation, how the issue of untouchability was being dealt in Dharmatma, and Gopal Krishna again was dealing with Lord Krishna and tyrant Kans, and how the kind of situation which was unfolding in the empire of Kans, and how Lord Krishna is able to seek the kind of justice for the people by getting rid of the rule of Kans. So similar kind of ideas, they were there in the society as well. People they in a way realized that how the British, they were trying to throttle the aspirations of the Indians in every manner. They were trying to dominate them, and they wanted to not only from the economic point of view exploit Indians at all levels, but at the same time from the cultural point of view, they wanted to dominate the Indians through the introduction of the English education and the other kinds of means which were employed by them. And we find that some of the films which were based on the poet saints like Sant Tukaram, Rajarani Meera, Chandidas, Sant Gyaneshwar, Bhakt Kabir, they were trying to show the humanist and the reformist approach of those times. And when women, they went to see films or the mythological films, then we find that more women, they went to the public sphere. So in that sense, the socialization of the women also took place. And when the news topicals accompanying these bhakti films, they were being shown, showing the leaders, the participation of the women. So the message was also being debated at home at that point of time. And leaders like Bhikaji Kama, or we find Sarojini Naidu, all of them, when they were being shown in the public sphere, more and more women, they also got influenced by them, and they also wanted to join the national movement, or they also became aware about the ideals of the national movement. And when a woman becomes aware, then the entire family becomes aware, because the children, they will also be influenced by her ideals. And we also find some of the semi-historical films in this period, where we find that the background of the historical film was being used, and it was being provided as an opportunity to present the visual splendor and the richness of the processions, costumes, war scenes, palatial forts, etc. And we find that Udakal in 1930 was based on the life of the Maratha warrior Shivaji, and it was a clever allegory on the overthrow of the foreign rule. And this film was originally titled Swaraj Toran, or the Flag of Freedom, in 1930, but censors revised its content and title to suit the colonial regime. So how the censors and the censorship machinery, they were behaving in that context, where they were ready to cut the content which was there in the films. They were ready to in a way delete the dialogues of that particular film which was inimical to the interests of the Raj or the British Raj. And we find that in 1943 a film called Sikandar was released, and it coincided with the Second World War. And India political atmosphere was tense during this period, following the call for civil disobedience by Mahatma Gandhi, and it also aroused the patriotic feelings and the national sentiments, because when it was being shown in the cantonment areas, the kind of dialogues which were there between Sikandar and Porus in the film, and where Porus says that how a king should be treated, that should be remembered by Alexander. And this is what the film talked about, that how the Indians, they were a perfect match for Sikandar or Alexander, and how they were able to stop him in when he came to India in his campaign. So such kind of presentations, they were trying to communicate that how British, they could also be stopped when they were in a way trying to entrench themselves in India further, even during the 1940s, when these kinds of ideas of democracy, good governance, etc., they were there. So such kind of presentations definitely were a help, and we find that the censor authorities, they banned the screening of this film in the cantonment areas, because when Porus was talking about driving out aliens from Bharatvarsh, it could also be understood in the framework of the reference to the British. So these kinds of things, they were also happening at that point of time, and we see that 1910s was also a period when different kinds of changes, they were happening across the world, whether the socialist revolution of 1917 or the communist revolution in India, and the labor and the peasant upsurge which was also happening. And various progressive cultural movements, they were helping in the rejection of the religious orthodoxy and the establishment of the new values and ideas in the socio-political sphere. So all this was also happening in the society, and some of the people, those who were associated with these ideas, they were trying to propagate them further. And we also see that how many of the leaders, they were also against any kind of religious fanaticism and caste based divisions which were there in the society, or violence against women, and they were also a result of these influences in the cultural sphere. And Gandhi himself wanted that the issue of untouchability or women's emancipation and Hindu-Muslim unity, all of them, they were central to the national movement, which was in a way now taken up by Gandhi. And we also see that how there was a lot of aversion to cinema in Mahatma Gandhi, and he refused to see films, and he only saw Ram Rajya in 1943, which was directed by Vijay Bhatt. And in that context, when we find that Gandhi equated films with all sorts of vices, gambling, etc., and how K. Abbas wrote an open letter to Gandhi regarding this, that how Gandhi, who is seen to be the leader of the national movement and whose ideas has a lot of influence among the youth as well as the mature or the adult generation. So how these people, if Mahatma will have this kind of an idea where he's saying that films is just like another vice like gambling, etc., then it will not have a positive impact on the youth and the masses. So he, in a way, he asked Gandhi to show interest in the film, and so that this kind of an attitude of Gandhi, which could be detrimental to the interest of the cinema in India, could be done away with. But we find that Gandhi did not oblige the film industry in that sense. He even refused to give his messages whenever he was being asked by any of the bodies associated with cinema, and he rejected that. He felt that films, they were not some kind of a positive influence on the masses. And there were other leaders like Tilak who supported cinema, and Phalke's Swadeshi cinema. And we also see leaders like Lala Lajpat Rai, they were also supportive of films, and they questioned the censorship policy of the British. and Satyamurthy used cinema for the propaganda purposes, and Sarojini Naidu was also supportive of the films. And we find that all these leaders, they were in a way trying to communicate or suggest that how films definitely can play an important role in terms of propagation of certain ideas which were associated with the national movement. And we also find that how Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, he lent voice to a film called Achut and Brandy Ki Bottle, and how these kinds of speeches, they became part of the films. And he also produced a film called Netaji Subhash, which was shown to the various leaders before independence in Connaught Place, in one of the theatres. So we find that how also Subhash Chandra Bose was instrumental in sending the footage of INA, or the Indian National Army, and this footage was used later in one of the films which was produced by Sardar Patel. So how the national leaders, in their own ways, in their own ideas, they tried to support the film industry in their own manner. As I told you, Lala Rajpat Rai was questioning the censorship policy of the British, and he was of this view that any kind of a policy which is being framed in the context of India should be in the interest of the Indians. And he also felt that any kind of a censorship policy, if it is inimical to the interests of the Indians, should not be imposed on India, or any kind of imperial preferences which were being given to the British films, that should also not be done in the context of India. And as I also told you, that women leaders like Sarojini Naidu or Rameshwari Nehru, they were also in a way talking about the film industry. As Sarojini Naidu was supportive, and Rameshwari Nehru was one of the members of the censorship machinery, where we find that he also realized that cinema will not be a good influence if it is not controlled in that manner, because many of the things which are shown in the films are not suitable for the generation in that sense. And we also find that apart from that, stunt films, they were also being made during this time. And JBH Wadia and Homi Wadia, both of them, they were very important from the point of view of the stunt films, as they were making a large number of them. And Nadia, who was popularly, her name was Mary Evans, who was from the Austrian Welsh lineage, but she became a very popular star in India and was popularly known as Nadia Hunterwali, because she also acted in a film called Hunterwali. And many of her films, the titles of these films, they were very provocative in nature. They had a lot of patriotic fervor in them. For example, Azadi or Hind Kesari, Desh Deepak, all these films which were made during this time, they were trying to communicate the ideas of patriotism. And we also find that how many of the banners, they were also mocking the authorities by naming themselves as National Movie Tone, Hind Mata Films and Indian Liberty. So not only the name of the films, but also the name of the banners, they were such that many of them, they could feel, many of the Indians or the masses, they could be motivated by such kind of things. We also see that during this particular period, when you talk about the stunt cinema, it was trying to communicate the nationalist overtones, the patriotism, and how they were trying to advocate democracy. And in the final scenes, we find that the climax was showing some kind of a verbal confrontation between the protagonist as well as the antagonist. And in these verbal exchanges, the ideas of democracy, good governance, justice, and the freedom of speech and expression, all of them, they were being advocated. And when the film ended, we also find that the victory of good over evil and legitimate over illegitimate, they sharpened the people's desire for freedom. So we find that stunt films, they were definitely making such a kind of a contribution, where we find that these kinds of ideas, they were being supported at this point of time. And when one was talking about these kinds of ideas of democracy, injustice, and freedom of speech and expression, we realized that how it was also the demand of the masses as well, because the masses, they were reeling under the pressure of the government, and how the British government, through the Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, all three of them, they were trying to in a way throttle the aspirations of the masses. In the course of discussion, we will further talk about more films and more ideas which were there in the different genres of these films. So we will talk all this in our next lecture. Thank you very much.